My name is Maarten Van Oordt. I'm a professor of finance, associate professor of finance at the Universiteit Amsterdam. The paper that I will be presenting is joint work with Charlie Kahn from the University of Illinois. And I would say it's kind of one of the founding fathers of the subfield that we in economics call payment economics. We're thinking about economics payments. Let me first start by just thanking the organizers for the possibility to present this paper here. I think that the blockchain center at UCL and UCL having a blockchain center very early on, it's been very visionary. I remember that one of my first papers, which developed in the area of cryptocurrencies, which developed a model about the exchange rate of cryptocurrencies. At the time that there were virtually no specialized conferences in the area of cryptocurrencies, payments, decentralized finance. So we were very happy to present that here. It was 2016, a long time ago, and nowadays it's becoming a more and more established field, almost a subfield. So really glad to be here again. So the title of the presentation that I'm going to give is the demand for programmable payments. And my training is as an economist. I worked at the Bank of Canada for about 6 years, where for most of the time I worked on the economics of digital currencies. So that could be both in the area of privately issued digital currencies like cryptocurrencies, could also be questions around central bank digital currencies, potentially being issued by central banks. There were of course many questions around cryptocurrencies, like what explains their exchange rates, why are they valuable, what value do they create? And then for central bank digital currencies, there are a lot of questions about like certain features, like should you include a certain feature in the central bank digital currencies? You can think about also recovery, privacy and payments. And also the question about programmable payments. So that's really how we started with this project. Now, as an economist, you often start with the question like, why do we do certain things? Why does doing things in a certain way, why is that optimal for people? So when we started thinking about programmable payments, started this project, we really wanted to start with the question, why do we pay the way that we do in certain situations? It was really hard to kind of think about like, oh, why should you use programmable payment? You don't really know and understand well why people pay in a certain way that they do. And if you kind of just consider it, it's quite different for different things that you can buy. So for example, if you buy a house, the way that you make the payment, it's pretty complicated. It depends on the jurisdiction, but typically funds are held by some safe third party in escrow. That third party checks whether the house changes ownership and then the funds change ownership. It's a pretty complicated process. But then once you own the house and you want a newspaper subscription, then the payment for that newspaper subscription works in a very different way. Right? It's not that for every newspaper you get delivered that you're going to have funds in escrow and wait until the newspaper gets delivered, and only at that moment the money gets released to the newspaper. Typically you pay like once every quarter, perhaps once every half a year, or once every month, and just the papers that get delivered every day to your house. So payments, they work different in different situations, and kind of understanding why we pay in certain ways, I think it's also important to understand in which situations programmable payments be useful. So what's a programmable payment? Well, you always have to start with the definition, so thank you for introducing this slide. So we define this as, and we're kind of collating different definitions that have been developed by different authors. As a transfer of funds that's automatically executed, conditional upon preset objective criteria. So you think about like you commit funds if you want to buy something, and then the release of those funds are going to be conditional on other things. So, and conditional on other things could be, for example, conditional on whether you got a house, conditional on whether a certain service was delivered or not. So A programmable payment, that definition is much more narrow than, for example, programmable money. You think about programmable money, people use that to capture like a much broader range of things that I'm not talking about today. Things like expiring money, limiting the purposes for which you can on which you can spend money. For example, all kind of these type of things, they're covered under the concept of programmable money. But what we can see is that programmable money and programmable features in cryptocurrencies, they really have spurred innovation in the area of programmable payments that really have triggered the interest in programmable payments. And why is that? Well, if you think about cryptocurrencies, basically they allow for automation of programmable payments up to a certain extent. You no longer need a custodian. You can actually program it into the programmable money, that the money will only be, that the transfer will only be completed conditional on certain things happening. So for example, you receive another asset. And in that sense, because you don't need that third party, it's kind of automated with substantial potential cost reductions in programmable money. Of course, cryptocurrencies, they're not the only situation in which you could use programmable payments. So these are just a few examples of advocated use cases of programmable payments. So people have been thinking about automated escrow services, atomistic clearing and settlement for security transactions. So if you buy things on the blockchain, you can actually make sure that the transfer only goes through if you receive the asset that the counterparty has promised to you. And also the enabling micropayments for pay-per-use concepts, right? So kind of a very popular example is you have your electrical vehicle, you look into the charging station, your car is going to tell the electrical charging station that there are funds with the car, and the car is going to pay as you get the electricity from the charging station. But like it's not just for potentially for cryptocurrencies, also for central bank digital currency. You could wonder, well, if programmable payments, if they have such a high potential, should we potentially provide that feature also for central bank digital monies if they were issued? And actually, if you follow the news, so there's of course a huge pilot in China, millions and millions of people actually involved with that pilot. So I'm not sure what the difference here is between the pilot and an actual launch. It's getting pretty great difference. But in China, they launched this advanced payment solution. It's called the digital yuan. That's at least how, it's called the yuan steward. That's how it's translated. And it basically allows you to actually make a conditional payments. So for example, the way that it introduced it, the example that they told as a use case, like you pay the money for the schooling of your child. And only as your child is taking lessons, the money gets released to the school. Now, enthusiastic accounts, they often focus on what's technical possible, but they ignore the motivation for making payments. And I think as an economist, like these technological developments, they raise several interesting questions about actual motivation, what could change. So for example, one question that you could wonder is, well, if programmable payments, suppose they were to become as cheap as normal payments, would they replace most of the ways that we currently make payments? Are we going to use programmable payments for all our payments in the future, or almost all payments in the future? And a second question that I want to ask, and that I would like to introduce with a small movie.
A strike engineer based in Europe. ZAP and Strike's headquarters is here in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. Typically, we pay Mr. Felton once a month with an international wire transfer and get absolutely crushed on fees, and it never gets there in time. Now that we can stream money, we can send money any amount, at any time, anywhere in the world, in less than a second and at no cost. Why get paid once a month? Mr. Felton, you want to get paid every 5 seconds?
Yeah, let's do it.
Boom. Every 5-second payroll deployed.
So that's a pretty funny video, I think. Like getting your payroll every 5 seconds. That sounds pretty cool. But you know, there's a deeper question actually below, which is like, well, if the transaction cost of payments are going to drop, will we observe that the number of payments will actually explode? Are we going to get our 5 seconds payrolls in the future? Is that something that's going to add a lot of value? And are we going to see this being very prevalent? So basically what we're going to look at is an environment. So we're going to establish a formal economic environment where we can actually study these type of questions. And it's going to be a pretty easy environment. There will be a buyer and there will be a seller. They need to pay. And basically what we will ask is the question like, economically, what's the most optimal way to do the payment? And then we will also allow for normal payments, and we will allow for programmable payments. And then basically we'll kind of look at the question like, well, if you look at the optimal payment arrangement, will programmable payments be part of that optimal payment arrangement? Because if programmable payments will be part of that optimal payment arrangement, you kind of know that there will be like a real demand for programmable payments there. Now, if you don't see that the optimal payment arrangement includes programmable payments, then you know that, well, in that particular context, it's just easier to use the normal type of payments. And we're actually going to treat programmable payments very favorably. So we are going to look at an environment where there will be no legal recourse. So in a situation where you don't get the payment, there's nothing you can do about it. So for example, if you think about international trade, that's a pretty likely situation because like the legal recourse will just be very expensive. Also for smaller payments or for super large payments. This might be a reasonable assumption. We are also going to assume that there will be a very high degree of automation. So we're actually going to assume that the cost for a programmable payment is going to be the same as the cost for a normal payment. So we're going to set up the framework in such a way that programmable payments are going to be really nice because there's no legal recourse and the programmable payment is actually making sure that your money is only released after you got the service. And we make programmable payments cheap compared to normal payments, the same price. And what we do en passant in this model is like we will actually develop, since we're looking at the optimal way to make payments, we will at the same time also be developing a theory about bill payments, like how do we normally pay our bills and why do we pay in that way our bills, how often do we pay them, etc. So it's kind of a byproduct of the more narrow question about what will be the demand for programmable payments. So just a quick preview of the results without much of an explanation, and then we go into the theory. So optimal payment arrangements for long-term relationships, what you observe is that they predominantly exist of simple direct payments, simply the payments that we use nowadays for most of our transactions. But what we do observe is that if you have economic relationships of short duration, then in our framework, those are situations where you really want to use the programmable payment. So go back to the situation where you're going to buy that house. Very short-term relationship, you just get the house, and then the relationship is over. Those are situations where you need to program. And then what we observe is that if you look at the change in the transaction cost and the demand for the number of payments in an economy, what you will actually observe is that there's a different effect along the extensive and the intensive margin. So the extensive margin is like the number of economic relationships that you form. So as the transaction cost goes down, you are able to form more relationships, economic relationships. So you can basically buy from more different type of people. And that's why you see that the number of payments increases. But on the intensive margin, so for existing relationships, if the cost of payments drop, in general, what you observe in our framework is that you actually want to make less payments. And why that's so, I'm going to explain in a moment. So the model, it's pretty simple in terms of like the number of parameters that exist. So there's a discount rate. So discount rate. So there are many non-economists in the room. But basically, what that's capturing is the time value of money. So it's more valuable to have money now than money in the future. And that row is measuring that. It's larger than 0. If it's the more higher it is above 0, the more impatient are people. So potentially the higher the opportunity cost of money. For example, keeping it with a central bank, with CareBank. Then there's a seller who can provide a service which has a cost C, which is larger than 0. And there's a buyer who wants to enjoy that service and gets a utility B from enjoying that service. And that's a function of time. So that can be like, it can be positive at times, it can be 0 at times. And then finally, there's an underlying payment system with a transaction cost K. And whenever you want to make a payment, the buyer has to pay this cost K. Just, you can think about it like it could be the cost of charge by the payment system. And potentially some administrative cost, right? You have to look at your statement and make sure that everything works out. The model environment is very simple. There's no asymmetric information. There are no government enforcement powers. There's no uncertainty. Despite like this simple framework, it's actually quite complex to solve the model, although the solutions are relatively intuitive. So what I would like to start to do is just consider a situation where you can only make one payment. So very simple situations. It can be a programmable payment. And we're going to look at a situation where, as a consumer, there's some time that you actually enjoy getting the service. And then, you know, at some point in the future, you will no longer enjoy receiving that service. And the B, so the benefit from getting the service, is larger than the cost of providing the service. So from an economical point of view, it would be nice if the service were provided. But of course, we have to make sure that it works with the payments. Now, if you think about like a single payment arrangement and well allowing for programmable payments, then basically you're kind of to solve for 3 things. You have to answer the question, what's the optimal amount to pay? When I'm going to commit those funds? And when will they be released? And if they are released at the moment that I commit the funds, and it's a simple payment, just a direct payment like we know nowadays. But if the funds are released at a later point in time and being conditional on whether the service was supplied in the interim, then it would be a programmable payment. So just looking at this graphically, so you can think about the potential situation. So this is a timeline. There's a service supply, which is kind of this blue area from 0 to till some point in the future. And you could pay in a certain amount, D1, at a point in time, T1, and it would then be released at a later point in time. And the question is like, well, what would be the optimal way? What would be the optimal values for D1, T1, and S1? Now, between T1 and S1, the funds are locked up, right? They guarantee the seller that he will get the money or she will get the money at the moment that she supplies the service. And then the fact that they are not released before the end, they actually guarantee the buyer that the seller won't get the money unless the service is supplied. Now, one thing that wouldn't work in this situation is, one thing could be that, well, let's first have the seller supply the service and then have the buyer pay in the end. Why doesn't it work in this situation? Well, there's no legal enforcement at all. And the reason why you cannot do this is, well, the seller would be providing the service, but then in the end, the buyer has no incentive at all to pay, right? There's no legal recourse, so if he doesn't pay, no problem for him. Now, what you also cannot do is you can also not pay everything at the start of the arrangement. Why is that the case? Well, the moment that the buyer makes the payment to the seller, then after that, the seller has no incentive anymore to actually provide a service. So in a situation where you have no legal recourse, the seller will not be providing the service. So you know kind of that the optimal arrangement will more or less look like this, in the sense that you need to pay at some point in the future, that the funds will need to be committed, but that they will be released only at the end of the contract. Now, before actually kind of looking at the optimal way to pay, the first one I look what's feasible, like what could we actually achieve in this world. Now, the arrangement that needs to be self-enforcing, meaning that both the buyer and the seller always want to keep the arrangement because there's no way to legally enforce the arrangement. So basically what you need is that the seller needs to be willing to supply. So that means that the value of the payment, when she receives it, discounted in the future to the moment that she receives it, must be more than her cost of providing the service. Secondly, again, somewhat, but just the interpretation is really simple. The buyer needs to be willing to pay when the time comes. So the cost of making the payment plus the amount that the buyer is paying needs to exceed the benefit of getting the service, not from the start, but actually from the moment onwards when he needs to make the payment. Right? So, because that's the moment that the buyer will need to decide whether to make the payment or not. Then, of course, there are some other constraints in the problem. The payment needs to be positive. You need to pay in before you pay out, and you cannot pay in the past. So basically, if you look at just the question like what's actually possible in this world, you can say, well, trading is feasible if a self-enforcing arrangement exists. So if there's an arrangement where both the buyer and the seller want to keep their promises. And basically what you get is like that the trading is only feasible if this condition holds. So what does it mean? Well, it means that the benefit of getting the service needs to exceed the cost of providing the service. That's kind of natural. And then there's this third component. So it's not just the cost, but it's also the cost of payments. And actually in the cost of payments, you see two parameters. One is the transaction cost, so what you actually pay to the payment system. And then there's a second parameter, which is rho, and rho measures the impatience in the economy. It's basically capturing the liquidity cost. So what is the cost of having liquidity locked up? We will refer, so this is about a single payment arrangement, but actually what you will observe is that this condition, it transcends beyond the single payment arrangement. So this will be a feasibility condition that holds for basically all payment arrangements that we will be talking about. So I'm going to refer to this as the feasibility condition. Now, okay, so we know exactly now when trading is feasible, but one thing you could be wondering about is, well, can we just do everything with one payment? Can we kind of capture an unlimitedly long relationship with just a single payment? And of course, technically, it is possible to lock up an almost infinite large amount in a payment. But economically, it's actually not feasible. So why is that? First of all, that's what this second theorem tells. Like the length of a self-enforcing single payment arrangement, it is limited. So why is it limited? Well, if you want to support a really long economic relationship with just one payment, it basically will require me to lock up funds. But if I extend the length of the relationship, I will need to lock up more funds because, of course, I need to pay more to the supplier. And I also need to lock it up for a longer period of time. So you get kind of an exponential increase in the total cost of the payment if you also incorporate the liquidity cost. So that's the reason why you actually don't want to use a single payment for really long relationships. It's not even feasible. Now then, just about feasibility. So we know that you can. So we know that exactly when trading is feasible, and we know that you cannot trade for an unlimited long period with just one payment. But now let's look at the optimal arrangement. So basically, the optimal arrangement, it solves basically the following problem. So the benefit of enjoying the service minus the cost of the payment, you need to maximize that as a buyer. And you maximize that by choosing the D1, the D1, and the S1. So how much you pay, when you pay, and when it is released. But of course, it only works if trading is feasible. It is subject to the constraints for self and for storage. And basically what you get is that the relationship, it looks like this. So on the horizontal axis, here in this chart, you observe the length of the relationship, or how long I would like to benefit from getting the service. And on the vertical axis, you see the timing of the payments and the amount of the payments. Now what you see, if like I enjoy getting the service, but I would enjoy it just for a really short period of time, then basically there's no trading is not feasible. Because basically the cost of payments is prohibitively high. It's just not going to work. I just want the service for a really long period, for a really short period of time, and making the payments just too expensive. But then if you go beyond that, if you extend the length of how long the buyer would want to get a service, then you get into a situation where having an arrangement is optimal. So you can actually trade. Basically what you observe is that the pay-in, it always happens before the payout. Then the amount, of course, is always increasing in how long the relationship takes place. But what you also observe is that there's this maximum on the length of the relationship. Like at some point, it's no longer optimal to lock up more money in that programmable payment because it's getting too expensive in terms of liquidity costs. Now, this is a single payment arrangement, and we're going to talk about a very wide set of payment arrangements. But I'm going to explain what's going to happen if you allow for more payments with the example of a two-payment arrangement before moving on. So we're going to talk about change of payments. We know that there's a limited duration of a single payment relationship. So what do optimal change of payments look like? Because normally it's quite normal in a normal economic situation that you make payments multiple times. And then basically what we get in a two-payment arrangement, there are basically two potential outcomes. The first outcome, it looks like this. So we're now twice committing money. So you're paying two amounts, D1 and D2. And there are two moments at which you do that. And it is released at two different points of time. And this figure that you're now seeing, it very much looks like the previous figure multiplied by 2. Right? Actually, the second part is exactly identical to what you saw in the one-payment arrangement. So that solution is exactly the same. So you're having a programmable payment and you lock up the money for some time. But then what's different is what happens actually in the first part of the arrangement when you make the first payment. So what's happening there? One thing that you observe is that the period that the money is locked up in the first payment is shorter than in the second payment. So both payments are programmable, but the first payment is locked up for a shorter period of time than the second payment. So why is that? Well, remember, you want to minimize the cost of payments. You want to make it as cheap as possible the way that you pay. And locking up money is costly. So why are you ultimately paying? Well, it's basically, you need to pay at the moment that the supplier of the goods or the services starts to wonder whether you would be really willing to make that payment, right? You're basically paying right before the seller thinks, oh, the person is not going to pay. Anyway. So basically, if you look at this period of time, the only thing that's left, the only time that the service will be supplied in the future is basically the time that the money will be locked up. So that provides relatively little incentives for the buyer to actually pay. Right? There's just this little time left. If you look at the first payment, there's a really long relationship left, which is providing the buyer a lot of benefits. So the seller can trust that this relationship is important enough for the buyer in order to pay, even if the buyer is allowed to pay relatively late. That's why the first payment can be locked up for a shorter period of time. Now it turns out that there's a second case. So you could imagine that the second part of the relationship is so valuable to the buyer that this period gets so short that you actually don't need to lock up the funds at all. Because the seller can just trust that the remainder of the relationship is so important for the buyer that the funds don't need to be locked up. And that's the second case, which basically the first payment would be a direct payment, and the second payment would be the programmable payment. So you enter a relationship with programmable payment, but you can start with direct payments. And actually what you also observe is that the blue area here is longer, meaning that the service can be supplied for longer. And why is that? Well, payments now have become cheaper because the first payment, you didn't need to lock it up at all. So that makes payments cheaper. There's no liquidity cost for that first payment in that sense. There's no cost of locking up funds. So basically what you observe from this two payment arrangement is that the future relationship, the rest of the relationship that will be happening in the future, creates trust. And the trust is like not just like I trust the person's blue eyes, but the trust here is the economic benefit of continuing the relationship in the future. So you could basically measure that, right? It's just a mathematical variable in the model. And so you could measure it as the present value immediately after a payment is released to the seller. So what's the value of the relationship to the buyer immediately after money is released to the seller? And actually what you do observe, if you look at multi-payment arrangements, so with more than two payments, is that when the trust variable is sufficiently high, then any earlier payments that are happening would always be direct payments. It's optimal to use direct payments in that situation. So if there's sufficient amount of trust, so it provides enough value for the buyer to make the payment, because that allows the buyer to continue the relationship, then you don't need the programmable payments. And it turns out that's not, that this condition at some point, if relationships are sufficiently long, then this condition always holds true. So this theorem, it basically says that every optimal chain of payments will start with direct payments as long as the time horizon is sufficiently long. So that's a pretty strong result. And then finally, you could kind of ask the question, well, what would happen if you have a stationary relationship? What would happen if you have an infinitely long relationship? And then basically we have this result here that you already achieve the optimum if you were to use direct payments only. So you don't need to lock up any liquidity at all for infinitely long relationships. So if you have a really long relationship, the direct payment will simply dominate. It's really for the one-time short-term relationships that you need the programmable payment. And what I promised at the start is that I would also talk about the number of payments that we observe in the economy as the transaction cost goes down. And basically from the results, there are two conditions there are two results that talk to the number of payments. The first one is on the extensive margin. So the number of when is a relationship, when is it feasible, when can you actually have an economic relationship where you pay? Well, there are the transaction costs that happened on the cost side. And of course, if the transaction cost goes down, it is more likely that trading becomes feasible. And when trading is feasible, it's possible to extend relationship with new people. Then secondly, there's a second result in the paper. It's basically that within a stationary environment, the size of each payment, it increases and the frequency of payments, they decrease if the transaction cost decreases. So why is that? Let's just think a little bit like, why don't we go to 5-second pay rules if the transaction costs become really cheap? Well, the reason is simply that once trading becomes feasible, I just got the 5-minute sign.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I will speed up then. Sorry, I got 5 minutes there, so
No, that's
that
right.
was my.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're trying to get some time for questions.
Oh, I see. I didn't know it. So basically, once you have a trading relationship, you want to minimize the cost of payments because that increases the benefit to both parties. And if you think about if the cost of payments become cheaper, then actually what happens is that the value of the relationship to both parties it increases. Right? There's more of a surplus left. So as a consequence, the seller can trust the buyer more that he or she will actually make the payment when the time comes because the value of the relationship has increased. So you can think about like, well, if the trading is just feasible, then you actually want to make people pay very often. But if you have like a lot of surplus from the relationship, then you know like this relationship is so important for this particular party that I'm fine with that party paying me less often because I know that he or she is going to make the payment. So what you can have, like what you see here in this figure on the horizontal axis is that the transaction cost and the payments per client. So this is the effect along the intensive margin that you actually want people to pay more often whenever trading is feasible as the transaction cost goes up. But then on the extensive margin, you can think about like, well, what's the percentage of transaction of trading relationships that's actually feasible? And if the transaction cost goes up, then you observe that actually less relationships becomes feasible. So if the transaction cost goes down, more trading relationships will become feasible. And then if you think about the full relationship, it's going to depend on like how do these two things balance, and it can take actually different type of forms. So this is just an example. You can have like this strange non-monotonic relationship between the transaction cost and the payments per person in the economy, in the sense that it can be increasing for low transaction costs and decreasing for higher transaction costs. Now, just to make sure that there's 1 or 2 minutes left for questions. So sometimes, so we see that actually you can avoid programmable payments by having repeated relationships. But often in the economy, you observe that there's not a relationship, there's not a repeated relationship. You just make a one-time payment, and that's just one case where I buy something. And kind of what you observe that the theory here in this paper actually provides an example of what happens then in the economy. Because what do we, for example, observe with credit card networks? Well, basically what they do is they function as middlemen. So they ensure that there are actually repeated interactions. So you're not repeatedly interacting with different stores, but you're repeatedly interacting with the issuer of your card. And you're paying the card issuer because you want to keep a good relationship with the issuer of the card. And similarly, the seller wants to make sure that they keep a good relationship with the acquiring bank because they have a repeated relationship with the acquiring bank, which is paying them the payments. So basically what you observe is that even in situations where there's no trust because there are no repeated transactions, that there are institutions that come into place that kind of start to act as middlemen that make sure that you actually have these repeated interactions. And then with this comment, I would like to thank you all for your attention.
No worries. So I think that we're so we do have a few minutes for questions. We're going to do this for 10 minutes. I believe that we're going to be about 10 minutes behind, so we'll just push everything by 10 minutes relative to what's printed on the diary for the rest of the day. Hopefully we'll make up some time, but not guaranteed. So does anyone have any questions for Maarten? All right, well, maybe I'll start with one. So Maarten, what I really like, I guess, okay. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, in case you ask the same one and you read my question.
All right. Well, all right. Well, then I'll start. Maarten, so it seems like what you're describing is very much related to the fair exchange literature, right? This idea of what it takes for two parties to actually execute a fair exchange. And we know that it's not really possible theoretically to have a fair exchange without a trusted third party, which is all of the concepts that we're very much familiar with in cryptocurrency literature and so on. And it seems like what you're describing is protocols for locking up money and committing in a way that can actually bind the different parties to the transaction so that one party is not left out when the other party starts. And where I thought you were going to go in the paper was towards this direction of what it is that we lock up in the very beginning. And because here, even in your model, it seems like there still is some period of time when the service provider is putting out service without any kind of commitment by the other party at all. Is there a way to, or have you explored ways of locking up capital from both parties, perhaps from the service provider itself as well as the other party, or other mechanisms for actually making it so that they're both bound to release something, as opposed to one party paying something and the other party contributing nothing?
I think there were two questions here. One. So one is about, I think, the third party. So what you, I think, observe currently, at least in traditional arrangements for payments, if you want to lock up funds, if you want to use escrow, you need this trusted third party. That must be a bank which has like a reputation to lose, and therefore it's kind of automatically a kind of creates automatically kind of a monopoly situation in some sense. So there's typically like only a few banks that can actually are trusted sufficiently for large transactions, for example. So you can imagine that a digital currency that would allow for this, there's a cryptocurrency or a central bank digital currency, that it could actually bring down those costs. And in the paper, we're kind of assuming that the cost of making that programmable payment, where you kind of lock up the funds, that has already kind of reduced so much that it becomes equal in terms of cost to a normal payment. And the second question, there were like what you observed in the optimal one payment arrangement is that actually the buyer only had to pay a little bit later, not right at the start. And the reason for that is that the remainder of the relationship was so valuable to the buyer that the seller could trust that even if the buyer makes the payment a little bit later, that the buyer is still going to pay. Of course, in a completely anonymous world where you could kind of easily clone identities, you would actually want to impose the constraint. You could very easily do this in the model that the buyer makes the payment right up front rather than a little bit later. Why the seller doesn't need to pay in the model is really because the seller is kind of committing something. They are committing providing the service, and they're providing the service in the interim until the payment is made. So there's no incentive in the model for the seller to actually commit funds. No, there's no reason.
Well, I mean, if the seller hypothetically wanted to hurt the buyer for some reason externally, then yes, presumably that there would need to be some kind of commitment to prevent the buyer from being put out the whole value before the seller starts doing anything.
Yeah, no, exactly. So for example, in the area of cloud services where I store your data, but you want to be able to punish me in case I delete that in the interim, that would be situations, I think, that are not exactly covered by the model. In that case, you would actually want to make the seller make a commitment to.
But could be compatible with what you're.
It could be compatible, yes. So,
Marcus, sorry to front run.
No, fine, all good. It actually wasn't my question. It's good news. Step back. Just a view for you on kind of the impact socially and economically of these programmable payments. So if you roll forward a few years, do you see it helping some industries or helping the exit of other industries and changing how people behave to us? Any thoughts you have on that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a difficult high-level question, I think. So it relates a little bit. Let me relate a little bit back to what I said in the end about credit card networks, where you kind of see like that what we observe in the economy is that there are actually many things substituting for trust. So it can be your relationship with the card with the issuer of your credit card. It can also be having a good record in a credit registry. And you could imagine that programmable payments will become substitutes for that, because they basically they don't require you to have that trust. So in that sense, it can be like a really important feature to be able to actually kick off new economic relationships, because what we saw in the model is like certain relationships, there's no trust to start with. There will never be that trust.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I think we have another question.
Thank you, Maarten, for the presentation. So, quick question about when you said why are we not making payments every 5 seconds? Like why are we not streaming payments? So, in a container environment, obviously, it depends on just those two parties, trust and all that. But in the case of these employees, being paid every other week or every other month, whatever. So if they don't have access to credit, right? So when to sort of pay their bills, cover their expenses, etc. Is that sort of a factor that you guys looked into in the case of that? Because obviously, if you don't have access to credit, then you need that sort of money every 5 seconds to go and buy stuff and pay your expenses.
Presuming that you have no other funds available. Yeah, so in the current model, we don't consider that. You could think about this being partly outside of the model. Like you could, provided that you have kind of this commitment from your employer, you could potentially be going to a bank and asking that person for credit. Could be costly to do, so there are certain reasons why it wouldn't happen perhaps in reality. So currently you kind of consider that decision separate. Another way, if you kind of really want to carefully analyze this in the current paper, would be to actually look at different discount rates. So currently you have kind of one liquidity cost, but you could kind of say, well, actually the cost of liquidity for the seller of the service, which would be the employee in this situation, could be just really high in the sense that they need the funds really fast. So I think like a potential extension of the model, which we don't do in the current version of the model, would actually be looking at different liquidity costs for the buyer and the seller's perspective. Seller really wanting to have the money fast and kind of see how that changes the optimal arrangement. But I think it's an excellent question, a good point to improve the paper.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're out of time. So we want to thank Maarten for his presentation.